up from the depths, 30 stories high, breathing fire, his head in the sky, Godzilla. No, those are not the lyrics from Blue Oyster Cult's song Godzilla from their fifth album Spectres in 1977, although that's a great song too. No, those are the lyrics from the Godzilla Saturday morning cartoon show. And if you're thinking there were no lyrics to the Godzilla Saturday morning cartoon show, that's probably because you're thinking of the 1998 Godzilla cartoon show, which they made as a follow-up to the first US Godzilla movie. No, we're not talking about that show. We're talking about a much, much older show. From 1978, the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla original animated series. A lot of people, even Godzilla fans, are not familiar with this series. And in Japan, a lot of people have never even heard of this series and are astonished to see what America did to their beloved Godzilla back in the 70s. So to understand how this series came about, you have to understand where Godzilla was as an intellectual property back in the mid-1970s. Godzilla's film series started in 1954 and ran in its initial series of films, ran until 1974. Unfortunately, the Godzilla film of 1974, Terror of Mechagodzilla, did not perform well at all, especially in Japan. It really was not well received, which is a shame because it was better than the film that had come before it, but it just was not liked and was not well attended. And so Toho Studios decided they were going to stop making Godzilla films and put the series on what they called hiatus for a period of 10 years. And as it turned out, that's just about what did happen. So since they weren't going to be using the character of Godzilla anytime soon, Toho discovered that there was another way they could make money off of the Godzilla character, and that was to license the character to United States companies to produce American-made Godzilla entertainment. And that's why in the 1970s, all of a sudden, American-made Godzilla entertainment was all over the place. There was Marvel Comics, had its own Godzilla series, which was quite popular. There was if you remember what Viewmasters were, there was a Godzilla Viewmaster adventure called Godzilla's Rampage, where instead of trampling Tokyo for once, Godzilla trampled Seattle, Washington, and went for the Space Needle. And there was a Godzilla Saturday morning cartoon show. One thing you have to understand about kids' entertainment in the 1970s is that there was a limited number of television channels available. It's not like today where you had 500 channels to choose from and you could always find cartoons at any time of the day. Cartoons were only on TV in certain time slots during the week, after school and Saturday mornings. So especially Saturday mornings, kids would binge Saturday morning cartoons for hours at a time because it was the only time that kids were getting exposure to a whole lot of them all at once. And some of these Saturday morning programs were recycled old cartoons, like Bugs Bunny cartoons. But a lot of them were cartoons that were made specifically to be shown in Saturday morning time slots. And a good example of that is the Super Friends, where DC Comics' biggest superheroes were adapted into a young child-friendly format. So Hanna-Barbera decided they were going to adapt Godzilla into a kids' Saturday morning cartoon show. Okay, great. But since the show was being produced for small children, it really had to follow some rules that the Godzilla theatrical movies did not. Obviously, you couldn't kill anybody, but you also had to watch out for what level of violence was portrayed. And this is tough when your intellectual property is a monster that tramples cities. So The creators of this cartoon had a lot of limitations on them, but in a way that worked to their advantage because they had to be creative. So first of all, they changed a few things about Godzilla himself. Godzilla was green in this cartoon, and contrary to what people seem to think, Godzilla never was green in any of his older movies. The first Godzilla movie in which Godzilla was green was Godzilla 2000. Godzilla was sort of a charcoal gray in all of his films. So making him green was a big change. They also changed his powers. In the films, of course, Godzilla could breathe a blast of radioactive flame that would incinerate anything. And what they did was they basically split these into two different superpowers. The Saturday morning cartoon version of Godzilla could breathe fire, but it was just an ordinary blast of fire, like a fire-breathing dragon would. And separate and apart from that, he could shoot laser beams out of his eyes, like Superman does with his heat vision, and he could zap things with his laser beam eyes, a power that he never had in any movie. So the blast of radioactive flame in a ray was sort of divided into two separate superpowers. And Godzilla was given some human friends. There was a ship full of researchers who had a relationship going with Godzilla where they could summon him by the press of a button on a Godzilla summoning device, a signaler. And whenever this ship, which traveled around the world, whenever this ship would get into dangers that they couldn't get out of, they would summon Godzilla and he would respond to their signal and rescue them. Now, the part where Godzilla responded to rescue people actually was on brand for where Godzilla stood at that point in Godzilla's history, because the last 4 or 5 Godzilla movies that had come out really portrayed Godzilla as a superhero. They made him someone who would come to the rescue and defend the Earth against more dangerous and mean-spirited monsters. The idea that Godzilla would obey a signal, though, was something that was completely off-brand and was not something that fit the tone of the Godzilla franchise. Godzilla had been under mind control in a couple of the movies, but that's not really what this was. So this was a plot device, basically, so that we could follow the same human characters from episode to episode. And they would travel around the world studying scientific anomalies and getting into trouble, usually involving giant monsters or giant robots, and they would have to call Godzilla to come to the rescue. Okay. Then there was Godzuki. Godzuki was a comic relief character that they presented to appeal to young children who would be watching the cartoon. And Godzilla was a gigantic creature, hundreds of feet tall. Godzuki was about 20 feet tall, so he was bigger than us, but nowhere near the size of Godzilla. And he was sort of a ridiculous, bumbling foil character. I think part of the inspiration for Godzuki was Minya, the son of Godzilla, but he was made even more clownish than Minya was in the movies. So this was the basic premise of the Godzilla cartoon show. But, as I said, they had to follow a lot of rules. Godzilla couldn't do the things that you would expect him to do in a Godzilla film. For example, he couldn't smash buildings. He couldn't shoot his radioactive fire at a person. He certainly couldn't step on people. Basically, they had to take away a lot of the things that made Godzilla, Godzilla. Imagine if you were going to make a Batman cartoon and somebody said, okay, here are the rules for your new Batman cartoon. You can't have him dress as a big bat. You can't have him use a never-ending supply of inventions and gadgets to get out of trouble. And you can't have him fight against kooky theme villains. Well, that's your whole intellectual property right there. You're taking away most of the things that make Batman Batman. That's essentially what they did in this case. They did to Godzilla uh, exactly that. They took away a lot of his feature traits. He couldn't be smashing cities. He wasn't the bad guy because he was the superhero in this series. He couldn't menace human beings directly. And, the writers were stuck with these limitations that they wouldn't have had if they were making a Godzilla film. But sometimes when writers have big limitations, it actually forces them to be more creative. And being a published author, I know this firsthand. When there are certain rules that you have to follow, you have to be more creative in the way that you go about getting around those rules. If you're familiar with classic Doctor Who, of course, is a character that travels in time and space. Well, some of the best seasons of classic Doctor Who were the seasons early in the John Pertwee years where Doctor Who was stranded on Earth. They took away his ability to travel through time and space. And the reason that those seasons were really good, part of the reason, is that they had to be creative in how to get the monsters and far out perils to the Doctor, since he couldn't go to them. And so there was really a lot of creativity needed to circumvent that restriction. So in the Godzilla animated series, Hanna-Barbera had to come up with some innovative ways to get Godzilla to be awesome without him doing the things that we would see him doing in his films. Most of the way they did this was by coming up with monsters for Godzilla to fight, and they were original monsters. Hanna-Barbera licensed the character of Godzilla. They did not license any of the related characters. They didn't license King Ghidorah. They didn't license Rodan. They didn't license the idea of Monster Island. They couldn't use any of those. All they could use was Godzilla himself. This also happened in the 1970s Marvel Comics, where Marvel licensed Godzilla and then discovered they could only use Godzilla. They couldn't use the related characters of King Ghidorah or Mothra or anything like that. So they had to come up with new threats of their own for Godzilla to fight. That's what happened in this series. The writers had to come up with their own monsters. Honestly, they did pretty good. They started out with a firebird, a sort of a pterodactyl that was living inside of a volcano, somewhat reminiscent of Rodan, but this was a monster that could generate fire. There was a subterranean monster, the Earth Eater. There were electric eel monsters that could zap Godzilla. There was a lost jungle where insects had grown to gigantic size, big enough to challenge Godzilla. And they were pretty good about coming up with scenarios as well, scenarios that would match the monsters that they were coming up with. A lot of the times, this crew of humans would come across a lost civilization and occasionally an alien civilization. And they would have to contend with whatever the aliens had as their champion, a giant monster of their own or a robot of their own, something like that. In terms of the plots of each episode, and there were 26 episodes, but it somehow feels like there were a lot more. Most of the episodes are similar to either Godzilla versus the Smog Monster or Godzilla versus Megalon. Those are the two Godzilla films that this series is most like, especially Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, because several times in this series they developed a monster that was an aberration based on something that existed in the world around us, like the seaweed monster. And it would keep growing bigger and bigger until it would threaten the whole world. Very reminiscent of Hydra, the smog monster. And sometimes they would just have, good old knockdown, drag-out fights with Godzilla against another monster. But it couldn't be too violent, so they had to have their knockdown, drag-out fight basically by pushing each other around. And sometimes things would happen to Godzilla, like Godzilla would lose the first round against the monster because he would be frozen or immobilized in some way. And then, of course, he would rally and come back at the end of the episode and win the second round against the bad monster. Actually, one of the best episodes of this series was the second to last episode, Island of Doom. And in this, there was no other monster. It was a way that the writers had finally found to give us what we wanted to see, Godzilla smashing everything, but have it conform to the practice standards of Saturday morning television at the time. So what happened was, in Island of Doom, there was an international criminal terrorist organization that had built up a huge army on an island out in the middle of nowhere. And they had nuclear weapons. And they were about to make their big moves to strike out against the world. And so when the human characters discovered this, they called Godzilla, and Godzilla had to come and fight the army of the terrorists, the army that had been built up over the course of years on this island. And so there was a huge long segment in this episode where the terrorist military was just throwing everything they had at Godzilla. Heavy artillery, tank fire, missiles, rockets, then a squadron of jet fighters. And of course, Godzilla wasn't killing anybody. So what would happen would be, for instance, the tanks would roll out and they would shoot at Godzilla. And then Godzilla would come closer to step on the tanks, and they would show all the people running out of the tanks, and then Godzilla could step on the tanks now that there was no one in them. Or when the jet fighters were coming through, Godzilla would, swat away a jet fighter or grab one in his hand, and then you would see the pilot eject and parachute to safety, and then Godzilla would destroy the now empty jet fighter. So they circumvented the restrictions that they had and gave the kids quite a lot of action in that episode. The final episode was The Deadly Asteroid, which was a pretty good way to end the series. It was an episode in which space aliens were going to destroy the world by making an icy asteroid crash into the Earth. And as the asteroid was getting closer and closer to Earth, there were natural disasters occurring all around the world. Well, I guess they were unnatural disasters because they were being caused by the approach of this asteroid. And it seemed impossible for Godzilla to do anything to repel the asteroid. But of course, there was a way that he did it, and he saved the Earth. He saved the entire planet in the final episode. So listen, when we were kids, we loved this show. We just loved it. Just loved it. We got to see Godzilla every week, which was not a guarantee. Back in the 70s, you had to wait for Godzilla movies to come on TV in order to watch them. You couldn't just put in a VCR or something. And so Godzilla movies might be on about once a month, but with a weekly show, you could get your fix every week. That was great. That was great for kids. And we understood that, there were limitations because it was a Saturday morning cartoon. We knew they weren't going to kill anybody on camera. I mean, this was not our first Saturday morning cartoon. We knew what the rules were. But it was good to see Godzilla mix it up with other monsters, and to know that he would be on next week. You didn't have to wait a long time to see his next adventure. This show ran, like I said, there was only 26 episodes, but this show ran for 3 years. In Saturday morning television, reruns were a big thing. You would end up seeing the same episode over and over. And so there was only one season's worth of Godzilla episodes, but it ran for 3 complete seasons. And they would pair it up with different other cartoons that were nothing like Godzilla and repackage the same product. And that was Godzilla, the first animated series. Now, people are familiar with the Godzilla the Animated Series from the 1990s, which followed the 1998 American-made fiasco. And I have to say, the 1990s Godzilla series, the animated series, was way, way, way better than the movie. So much better than the movie. If you've ever just, not bothered with the 1990s animated series because the movie was so bad, you should check it out. It's worth seeing. Give it a shot for a couple of episodes if you haven't before. It's so much better than the movie. Don't let the movie discourage you. But if you'll notice, there are some similarities between the 1970s series and the 1990s series. They're not in the same continuity at all. Godzilla looks completely different, behaves differently, but there are similarities. In both series, Godzilla is friends with a bunch of scientists that travel around the world in a research ship. And in both movies, Godzilla can be summoned whenever there's an emergency by the press of a button. I always wondered, even as a kid, I wondered how that worked. Okay, Godzilla could hear the signal and he would be coming to the rescue, that's fine. But how did he get there in 2 seconds? Well, how did they know Godzilla wasn't 1,000 miles away and it would take him, 3 days to get here? He always seemed to be lurking in the water just off the shore of wherever they were. But I guess the story wouldn't work otherwise. And that was something I noticed in both the 70s and the 90s Godzilla series. So do you remember the 1970s Hanna-Barbera Godzilla? Do you remember watching it when it was first on? Or did you discover it, if you're a younger viewer, did you discover it on DVD or online somewhere? What did you think of it? It's certainly different from the Godzilla movies, but it did give kids a fix of Godzilla, so it was worthwhile in that way. Well, let me know in the comments. And listen, if you liked vintage horror and classic monsters, check out my book series, the Mourner's Woods books, that are available on Amazon.com. My name is Paul Edwards. Thanks for spending some time reminiscing with me about the Godzilla animated series from 1978. And I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.